So welcome to the latest ATMA webinar. ATMA is the Asia Talent Mobility Alliance, and today's update is on Vietnam and Thailand. I'm delighted to be sharing today's event with Debbie Bayon from Crown Worldwide, Mobility based in Singapore, and Debbie covers APAC. And also I have Dermot Whelan representing Reload Network Asia, based in Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam. And my name is Andy Flint, and I'm based in Bangkok, Thailand. And as we get started, we've got a quick general knowledge questionnaire for you, which should pop up on the screen now. And if you wish to join in, please try the questions. Next slide. Who is ATMA? ATMA is the Asia Talent Mobility Alliance and is for the non-profit organization dedicated to enhancing innovation and development of the talent mobility industry in Asia. And as you can see from the slide, the vision is to enhance the innovation and development of talent mobility in Asia. We also have on the screen the ATMA Foundation partners. Those are Grable, ECA International, Reload Network Asia, and Reload Japan. So this is an update as part of an ongoing series of country updates by ATMA. You can find out more from the website and more about the foundation partners, and that information is on the website. So to get started, I'd like to hand over to Debbie, and she's going to discuss immigration in Thailand and Vietnam. Over to you, Debbie.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, just to really highlight some of the things that are happening within the immigration sphere in both Thailand and in Vietnam. Firstly, the Thais have obviously post-COVID tried to now bring people back to the country. And in May 2024, the government announced some major updates to its visa policies. One of those was visa on arrival. And so what they've now done is they've actually extended the countries that can apply for visa on arrival to 31. Another element of change was around visa exemption, again, to try and attract people into the country, primarily to stimulate tourism. Visa exempt countries now sit at 93, which is up from 57. So it's a significant increase in the number of visa exempt countries. And that does include some major countries like China and India. And the other thing that's happened very recently is on the 15th of July, the visa exempt countries are now given leave to remain for 60 days rather than 30 days. That is really designed to allow people to plan their travel a little bit better and also to reduce the amount of work that the immigration department has when people wish to extend their tourist visas. So coming back to forthcoming changes, which is linked to more business type travel, there will be an electronic travel authority. It's been announced, and then very, very quickly there was an announcement earlier this week to say that it's been postponed. The reason for the postponement is that the government needs to work with authorities a little bit more in relation to ensuring that the visa exempt countries are going to be able to manage the online submission for the ETA. But it's designed to streamline immigration processes for visitors. It was originally meant to launch in December, but as I said, it is postponed, but it will be installed probably sometime next year. From the perspective of work permits, there's no major changes to the primary work permit process. It's still very bureaucratic. Timelines are relatively straightforward. It doesn't take too long to get a WP3 pre-approval for a work permit. Then you still need the non-immigrant B or the non-immigrant O visa to arrive, and then you do the work permit and dependent permits afterwards. But it is a very bureaucratic process. And there is still a requirement for individual applicants and dependents to attend immigration when an application is either being dealt with for the first time or when it's being renewed. Thank you, Renu. Can you move to the next slide, please? Coming back to more other long-term visa options, there has been an introduction for visas that are really applicable to digital nomads. Obviously, this is something that there's a lot of pressure on around this part of the world. And what's really happened in Thailand is that this new visa has been introduced really to allow people to stay longer than 30 days. You are now allowed to stay up to 180 days. But there are some eligibility requirements, as you can see in the slide there, to actually qualify for that. So you have to be at least 20, you need to have some savings, and obviously the visas themselves are not very cheap to actually apply for. But there is a digital nomad visa now, which is a significant change to what was available before. And also on the other end of the spectrum, retirement visas. Clearly, Thailand has been looking to attract retirees, again, invest in the country, spend money in the country. The principal change on the retirement visa side has been very much around medical insurance. It has been quite onerous for retirees to have some significant medical insurance, was up to 3 million bahts worth of medical insurance. But now that has actually been reduced to around 440,000 baht from a medical insurance perspective. The other side to this, however, is that the minimum requirement from a financial perspective is still quite onerous. You still need to have 800,000 baht in a bank account for 3 months before the application is lodged. And that does provide some significant issues for some people looking to retire to Thailand. But there's a lot happening, and I think as we move forward, especially on the ETA side and on the shorter term visa side, there is likely to be some more changes that we'll be able to report to you later. So thank you. Now I'd like to move on to Vietnam. Similar to Thailand, what Vietnam has also been doing is trying to actually stimulate arrivals, both from a tourism perspective and a business visa perspective. So visa waiver countries, there's around 13 visa waiver countries for Vietnam. You were able to arrive, providing you had a ticket to show you were arriving and leaving, and stay 15 days. That period is now extended to 45 days. The country has also opened up an e-visa system whereby you can actually apply for an e-visa to enter. The number of countries and the number of ports where this is available has now extended from 33 to 42. And the noteworthy point around the e-visa situation is that it allows a 90-day stay. The critical problem with the e-visa process at the moment is that the portal has not been working particularly efficiently. There have been delays in decision making, and it has been reported that there's been some difficulties with applicants making payments. So it is there. The authorities are very aware of it, but it will obviously take a little bit of time to become a little bit more efficient. In relation to work permits, I'll come to that in a second. There have been some changes in relation to the work permit process in Vietnam. And alongside that, the Ho Chi Minh People's Committee have been delegated now to approve work permits. This is a change from immigration making decisions in relation to the industries related to banking, finance, and insurance. It's very new and it is taking time to bed in because the authorities, obviously, in Ho Chi Minh don't have the experience that the immigration authorities have. But they are referring back, and it is the decisions now of the Ho Chi Minh People's Committee who are making decisions on those elements of work permits. There's also increased digitalization being seen, online submission of applications. Again, coming back to the e-visa process, there is some system constraints being reported, and there is still a requirement to submit physical documents to support the online process. But again, very positive in relation to moving forward and trying to reduce bureaucracy. And finally, just before we go to the work permit changes, companies are also now starting to focus on localization and looking to train Vietnamese nationals to take over positions formerly filled by expatriates. More localized roles are being offered. And just very, very interestingly, very recently, Standard Chartered Bank has just appointed a Vietnamese CEO, which is quite a move away from looking at a fully expatriate kind of model for the from the banking industry. Renu, can you just move to the next slide, please? This is just a very high level guide to the changes that have taken place on the work permit side. There's quite a lot of changes in relation to, and this is really designed to try and help the work permit process. And I know Dermot's probably going to comment on this as well, but the reality is they've been trying desperately to make life a little bit easier. So there's been changes to the requirements for obtaining permission to use foreign labour. And that means that basically you have to seek approval within 15 days of someone starting rather than 30. And also there has to be job opportunities posted to allow Vietnamese applicants to apply. There's been changes to the foreign experts role where the preliminary requirements have been simplified. The acceptable paperwork for experts or technical workers and the roles that they're filling have been expanded. And particularly also the process of renewing a work permit has been simplified as well. So again, the government, the same as in Thailand, are trying to open up. They're trying to make things a little bit easier. Clearly, there are some barriers that still need to be overcome, but there's a lot of positivity around the immigration scope with both Vietnam and Thailand. Andy, I'll hand back to you now.
Thanks, Debbie. That was great. And what I'd like to do now is hand you over to Dermot, who'll give us an update on Vietnam.
Thanks, Andy. Before I get into the sort of meat of my presentation, just a quick comment on some of the things that Debbie said. Full agreement with her. The government here is very, excuse me, cognizant of the fact that they do need to try and simplify the work permit application process as much as possible. It is quite onerous, very bureaucratic. The points that Debbie made are very well made. Just one addendum to that. Vietnam has now officially signaled its interest in joining the Hague Convention or the Hague Apostille Convention, and that's an agreement between countries where they recognise each other's documents. A document gets apostilled at the origin country; it's accepted as a destination country. There's no further processing or verification of that document involved. Vietnam is not a participant in that program. But they have signified or signaled their interest in joining, and if they do, then that would be a significant step forward in simplifying and removing the amount of stress and time and effort in satisfying the documentation requirements that are needed to support a work permit application. So positive news. I don't know when they will exceed. The only other thing I'll say about that is that China acceded to the Hague Convention in Q3 of last year. So Vietnam keeps a close eye on the way the Chinese do things. They take their cues from mainland China on a number of things, especially in terms of the economy and managing foreign investment and foreigners and foreign exchange. So I think the fact that China has recently acceded to the Hague Convention and that Vietnam has now signaled its interest in joining, I don't think is coincidental. So hopefully more positive news on the work permit front, and let's hope that in the medium term now, the whole work permit application process will become simpler, more transactional, more transparent, and more predictable. Okay, I just wanted to touch on three areas today: housing, schools, and cost of living, and just want to make some comparisons and contrasts in those three areas. So we take a quick look at housing. These are just typical rents. Ho Chi Minh at the top in red, Hanoi underneath in yellow. I won't go through them line by line. Basically, Hanoi rents are approximately 30% lower than they are in Ho Chi Minh. And if you look at sort of 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom luxury apartments, if you look at that column on the far right-hand side, I don't think there's anything there that would surprise a mobility manager or a HR department in terms of costing and assignment, etc. It all seems to be fairly reasonable and yeah, it's typical for this part of Southeast Asia. The only thing I will say, I know Andy's going to talk about property in Bangkok later. There, you do not get the range of properties available in either Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh as you do in other parts of Southeast Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand. There's just not the housing stock available. So, excuse me, at the upper end, yeah, you don't see, $10,000 plus rentals very, very often. It's very rare that you would A, have an assignee who would want that, and B, finding a property available in that price bracket. So, but luxury is a relative term, but that's a sort of high end equivalent in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh. Very acceptable living conditions for a typical expat assignee. No issue, and relatively affordable as well. Okay, next screen, please, Andy. So the two major urban centers in Vietnam, Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh, yeah, very much a tale of two cities. If you look last year in 2023, the number of new residential units that were completed and came online in Ho Chi Minh City last year, 8,700 units. Bear in mind that the population of Ho Chi Minh City is over 9 million people. In Hanoi, which has a much smaller population, 5 million, second largest country in the city, second largest city in the country, 13,000 residential units came to market last year. If you sort of go forward to this year and the latest figures, Q1, you can see that there's just as the number of new units available in Hanoi just staggeringly low. Sorry, in Ho Chi Minh. Contrast that with Hanoi in Q1, over 4,000 residential units were delivered to market. So there's a real supply side issue in Ho Chi Minh with housing. There's lots of reasons for this, and I won't go into them. There's been a burst in a housing bubble. There's been a corruption scandal involving a major developer. There's been political fallout because of that, et cetera, et cetera. There's been basically sort of administrative seizure in the issuing of property licenses and getting projects greenlit by the government, et cetera, et cetera. And it's going to take another couple of years at least, I'd say, for that situation to sort of play out and resolve itself. So certainly in the short term, supply side issues in Ho Chi Minh. That's sort of reflected in the final figures on the right-hand side of this slide. Average rent increases in 23, 24. You're looking at 5 to 15% in Ho Chi Minh. That's across all districts over the city. But in Hanoi, which doesn't have the same supply issues as Ho Chi Minh, then rents are, basically ticking along at the same rate as cost of living increase, the CPI index. Anyway, there's a snapshot for housing in Vietnam. Certainly, yeah, some issues in Ho Chi Minh that are it's going to take a little while to solve. Thanks, Andy. Yeah, we'll go to the next screen, buddy. Okay, schooling. So the second pillar of expat life or family life in Vietnam. So it's big business. When you're looking at annual tuition fees for a senior high schooler of 30 to 40,000 US dollars a year, which is fairly typical across the region, I'd say, then it's big business, and because of that, then the sector attracts quite a lot of entrepreneurs. So as you can see, if you look at the left-hand side of the screen, there's been a proliferation of international schools in Vietnam, and again, Vietnam is just following the trend in the region, I think. But there's been a proliferation of international schools. At the last count in Ho Chi Minh, there were 41 different institutions using the word international in their name. And there were 28 international schools in Hanoi. Now, international in name, but if you look at the criteria I've sort of listed below, bullet point below, then really sort of local in character. And I'm not being disparaging here, but I'm just trying to, relate the fact. Local in the sense that, most of these schools, a lot of these schools are bilingual in terms of medium of instruction. So it's Vietnamese and the other language, whether it's French or English or Japanese or Korean. Excuse me, they offer a third country or a Vietnamese curriculum, or quite often a hybrid. So there's very much Vietnamese content in the curriculum that they offer as well as the medium of instruction. The majority are Vietnamese students. Fees are a little lower, as you would expect, not always the case, but in general. And primarily, these schools are locally owned. They are businesses, no question. So once you take those factors into consideration, then if you look at the right-hand side of the screen, then, and this is my count, so take this as you will. But I think really what we would regard, and we as foreign assignees living in Vietnam and people involved in the mobility industry, what we regard as international schools, I think the criteria there are reflective of that. Single medium of instruction. Generally, it's either English if it's Australian, British, or the American school, and French, German, Japanese, etc. For the other communities that those schools service. Home country curriculum. So if you're in a British school, then they're offering the national curriculum and/or IB. Majority of students are foreigners. The main British international school in Ho Chi Minh City, in District 2, BISS, British International School of British International School, 52 nationalities, last count. Fees are significantly higher, and then these schools are foreign owned. So once you take that into consideration, then the number of international schools in Ho Chi Minh, really for the sort of institution that services the sort of clients that we generally deal with, you're looking at a little bit more than a handful in Ho Chi Minh, 14 schools, in Hanoi 7. So that's some differentiators there. I'm not making any value judgments there. Clearly, there's a lot of choice available to assignees. Some of the local international schools do offer the IB, for example. So there's more choice available, certainly. And then because of also choice, but also because I think there's been, post-COVID, and the economy is still sort of recovering, and assignee numbers are starting to build back up again. There hasn't really been much stress in terms of waiting lists at the sort of tier 1 international schools. There was, again, going back to BIS, they had a small waiting list at year 7, but I think that got sort of resolved out. I'm not aware of any major issues at any of the other tier 1 international schools where there's been long waiting lists, students have been turned away or told to find an alternative or defer a year. None of that's been coming out of Ho Chi Minh or Hanoi this year. Okay, that's schools. And then the last area I just want to touch on, cost of living. That tile on the top left, Vietnam voted the most affordable country by global expats for the 4th year running. So that source is Expat Insider. They polled 12,000 expatriates in 170 countries. And for the 4th year running, Vietnam has come out as the most affordable place for an assignee to be. That kind of chimes with my experience. It is fairly low cost here. Excuse me. If you look at the other indicators there, CPI, the Consumer Prices Index, inflation, basically, interest rates, GDP growth, they're all signs, those macro figures, they're all signs that the economy is sort of in balance, is not showing any sort of real stress. That last figure there, average salary, that's very much for local. That we're not talking about expats here, but I mentioned that because earlier this year the government they raised the mandated minimum wage. And that resulted in on average a 7.4% growth in local salaries in H1. So there's consumers have got a bit more money in their pocket. Again, that's going to fuel the consumer side of the economy. And you're seeing 5.5% GDP growth. It's not sort of Asian tiger level from 20 years ago. It's not up at 8 or 9%. But I think it's ticking along relatively well. And like I say, the economy in general seems to be in balance. Over in expat land, that's sort of two of the big sort of areas of cost of living concern for expats. Rentals, as we saw in the previous screen, there's a little bit of rental pressure in Ho Chi Minh City. So it very much depends on district and property. But as I've said, with the supply side issues, and if we do see a significant uptick in assignee numbers coming into Ho Chi Minh over the next 1 to 2 years. That will obviously put pressure on rentals as well. All right. And then I think the other main area of concern in terms of cost of living for expat families is obviously school fees. So there's the old saying, there's two certainties in life, death and taxes. Well, I think there might be a third, actually. The fact that international school fees go up 5 to 6% every year, regardless. And I speak from experience as a parent, having put a child through a international school system here, 10 years ago now. But yeah, just regardless, doesn't matter what the economy's doing, what the business is doing. Every year, school fees went up 5-6%, regardless. So maybe that's a third certainty in life. But yeah, apart from that, then it's a pretty soft landing here. There's really not much to stress an expat assignee in terms of cost of living. I think, housing and schooling, important considerations, still no real sort of pressure or deterioration in those sort of markets and what's available. So all in, not too much concern on the cost of living side, certainly in this country. Okay, that's it from me. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Dermot. Great update on a country I used to live in 25 years ago. So it's great to see the changes that have happened there. Right, on to me. My turn to give you an update on Thailand. My update is going to be based and focused on Bangkok because that's by far and away the largest market that we have in the country. And just going back to Dermot's point about the Hague Apostille, Thailand has not signed up for that. And that continues to give us the ongoing challenges of documentation, which I'm sure Debbie sees every day with the issues that she has to deal with and we have to deal with as well. So my first subject is on housing. And as you can see from my slide here, we have focused on the apartment condominium. There are plenty of houses as well. But due to its large size, Bangkok has properties to suit most budgets and requirements, but it does depend on location. The rental market is growing with many new buildings, but the size of the units is also decreasing as the land becomes more expensive in the city. The size gets smaller, but also the rents go up as well. One of the big advantages that Thailand's had since I've been living here for 22, 23 years is that public transport system, known as the BTS and the MRT, has grown from being 20 stations on a single line in 2000 to currently growing to 120 stations that are covering all points within the city. And this has enabled the suburbs to become more reachable and achievable for those who want to perhaps spend either a little less money on their property requirements or get something more for their money and still be able to commute. The city centre, Sukhumvit, Silom areas, if you know Bangkok at all, is still the centre of the city in terms of commerce and for the bigger companies here with their head offices. So this remains the area where the higher rents are as well as the demand. The central area remains popular for all the time that I've been here, and the prices continue to go up, and they're going up faster than the outer areas for the suburbs. And there is a shortage of high quality units. Again, supply and demand. What we are seeing in Bangkok is there are more Chinese nationals who are coming in and buying and taking up space, whether that's either to live here long term or because of their companies that are bringing Chinese nationals in here because of the influx of Chinese industry, which I think Debbie's going to talk to us about a little bit later as well. So moving on to the next slide, which is education. Bangkok has about 100 plus international schools, which are in Thailand. We have an accreditation system, which sounds like a slightly different version of Vietnam. So to be an international school, you do have to get accreditation with a government entity. However, apart from being a big business, there are really only 6 schools within the Bangkok area, which would be classified as top level. And they've all been established in the case of ISB, for nearly 50 years, in the case of Patna, for more than 40. The schools under the top tier, you've got second and third tier, and they're offering a high standard, and they're also offering IB, UK education, and the US system. And many of these schools are franchises of international brands such as Harrow, Shrewsbury. Um, we've also got Berkeley College and a few others. So those schools are also scattered around, and again, they're in the suburbs. So education could depend on where you're living and where your the assignee's work location is, and invariably there's a compromise on whether you want to live somewhere in terms of the ease of getting to work, ease of getting to school, and public transport, and the quality of the property you want to live in. This summer, we saw within the top 6 schools, there have been some limited places and waiting lists in grades 6, 7, and 8. And this has resulted in some situations where if there's been 2 children, one of them may have been able to get into the school and the other one may have had to go onto a waiting list. But that is also because we have got, again, an influx of Chinese nationals who are bringing their children in and doing education and education visas. Costs for the students at the top level are, let's say, 20 to 35,000 per student. And for the big schools, the top schools, you also have to pay a signing on fee, which can be the equivalent of 1 year's worth of fees. And then even in the grade 2 schools, those fees are still kind of costs that are applicable. When you go down into the third tier, there are cheaper options for, again, IB or UK or US. In the top tier, there are some requirements on the percentage of students need to be international and those that need to be or can be local students. When you get into the tier 2, tier 3, there is a slight change in the percentages. So that's my education. Moving on to cost of living. Bangkok is still a relatively low-cost expat city when compared to Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, but it is still more expensive than Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh. And the expat packages tend to reflect that as well. The general costs have been increasing for eating out, increasing costs of imported foods. The cost of local labor has gone up, which has also had an impact on these increases that are being felt in the market. What Thailand also has is world-class healthcare. We have some fantastic hospitals here, which are seen and used as medical tourism. And we see a lot of people coming in from the Middle East, from China, India, and around the region to go to what would be some of the best hospitals in the world. However, with world-class healthcare comes world costs as well. It's very, very expensive here. So it's really important that the expats, the assignees have good cover for their insurance and that if anything does happen to them, they will get good care, but it will come at a price. As you can see on my right at the side here, the cost of electricity here is relatively cheap, which we do need to have because of the amount of aircon we need to use because it's always so warm. And as Bangkok is, I think, within the top 3 warmest cities in the world over the year, we tend to have to use a lot of electricity. And petrol is still also relatively cheap. If I compare petrol here to the price of, say, in the UK, it's about 50% cheaper here to run a petrol car. Diesel is a little bit more expensive. So that cost is relatively low. And inflation at the moment has moved from what was 6% in 22, 23, and it's moved down to 4%. So we are seeing some slight increases in inflation, but they have decreased. So those are my 3 updates. And what I'll do now is I'm going to hand over to Debbie, and she's going to give us an overview on global mobility trends.
Hi, thank you, Andy. Yeah, so really, just to kind of highlight some trends that are taking place, both that affect Thailand and Vietnam, but are perhaps a little bit more widely affecting the region. What we've been seeing is assignments into China and assignments into India specifically not picking up post-COVID. It might have been expected that assignments will have picked back up into those types of locations, but it hasn't. I mean, actually, you can turn it around, and the trend is that both China and India are now looking to really try and export their expertise. You've heard this from both Dermot and from Andy already. There's a lot of Chinese now traveling overseas. There's a lot of Chinese expertise looking for employment outside of China now with the EV markets and a lot of the things that China are obviously developing. There's a lot of assignments coming out of China. Looking also slightly more widely, Singapore's had some specific regulatory changes. There's now a points-based system for employment passes, which is actually now significantly affecting people's ability to renew. And again, having then employers look at alternative options. Malaysia is an alternative option that is seeing some significant increases in assignee populations. And also what's happening is secondary markets are starting to open up, and as businesses are looking elsewhere, and Vietnam is specifically benefiting from that. Manufacturing, perhaps, for Vietnam is now growing because suppliers don't want to work with China, perhaps. That's geopolitical as well, but there's quite a lot of things happening. In relation to costs, obviously business is challenging, it remains challenging. Global mobility managers are now looking to reduce costs. What they're looking perhaps is, can localization take place for assignees? Can permanent transfers be used rather than long-term assignments? Can businesses hire foreign nationals locally? And in a lot of locations, Thailand, Vietnam, in a lot of locations in the Asia Pacific region, it is possible to hire locally. The person who you hire may well require a work permit or an employment pass, but they are already living there locally. So that obviously is then a cheaper option than an assignment. Policy flexibility is also critical at the moment now. Strategy, innovation, technology are all affecting assignments. They're all affecting decisions. Also, there's a different generation now. You've got Gen Z, you've got Gen Y, and they have different expectations. Technology is a very big issue now. Everything needs to be done on an app rather than perhaps what used to happen in relation to management of assignments and moving. As I said, geopolitical events are affecting everything in this part of the world. There's been a lot of elections globally. We're still waiting for one big election in the US, which again is probably going to have some effect in this part of the world. But things are, changing because of the regulatory changes that are coming around from the perspective of the elections that have taken place. And finally, environmental concerns and sustainability are very much at the forefront of the relocation industry and of the global mobility industry. Vendors are expected to have sustainable options for the assignments. Our clients are looking for vendors to provide sustainable options, and everything that's being done, whether it's a move that's involving a shipment, whether it's an air freight, carbon calculators. There's a lot of things that are now affecting the way things are done, and environment and sustainability are critical factors that will continue, I think, to obviously become very big in relation to the way the global mobility industry moves forward. Andy, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Debbie, for the update. And I am unable to see who is online, but I just want to see, Renu, if you're there, do we have any questions, or are there any updates? Or anybody got any questions?
You can see on the chat.
Okay. I have heard managing expectations in the Bangkok market become tricky these days as property rental prices increase. Can you speak to this? Yes, I'll try. Expectations in Bangkok are that there are many, many properties here, and that is perceived to be a relatively cost-effective location to live in. The managing of expectations is about the expat, the assignee arriving here. They've been online. They've seen lots of properties that they think that they can manage that were inside their budget. They're going to live by the river. They're going to have this stunning view looking over Wat Po. The sunset's going to be there. And there's a property that's on the website that says they can have that for $1,000. The reality is that property has either never existed or it existed once, and the agent that's keeping it up there is also not being honest about what the availability is. So trying to manage the expectation is about trying to ensure that the value of what we're giving them in terms of finding the right property and what they can expect to pay is, again, it's about location, location, location. There's a property for practically every budget, as long as that person can manage what their expectations are. So, Steve, I'm not sure if that answers your question, or I've just waffled on a little bit without too much detail. Well, question for Dermot. I have heard of challenges around larger condos, such as 4-bedroom units in Ho Chi Minh City. Can you speak to this, please?
Yeah, they're few and far between. So if you have a family of four, two sort of adolescent children, want their own bedroom each, mum and dad in the master, and you want a fourth bedroom either for a guest or a home office, then yeah, your choices are very limited, and depending on the time of year, the realtors that we work with, there may not be any supply in the market at that particular time, especially as we get into towards the peak season, and interest in properties obviously spikes. So definitely, that's very much true in Ho Chi Minh. I think Hanoi, the situation is a little bit easier. But certainly, going back to the point I made earlier, that there are real supply side issues in Ho Chi Minh, and they will remain for at least a couple more years until the property sector and developers, etc., are allowed to develop again. Projects get approved, financing gets approved, etc., etc. So yeah, it's still going to be challenging for certain property types for the next 2, 3, 4 years, I think.
Dermot, can I ask you a question
Mm-hmm.
about the property in Ho Chi Minh? Are you seeing a similar situation in the central districts of the unit sizes becoming smaller?
Yeah, sure, of course. But I think that's true all over Asia. Yeah, properties sort of developed on greenfield sites 20 years ago, fairly generous footprint. Land costs were significantly lower, etc. Now, of course, the land values are driving much, much higher density properties, smaller footprints, where it's an older property, you might have 4 units on a floor. The newer ones, you've got 6, 8, 10. Yeah, and I would say a 30% reduction in sort of usable floor space, fairly typical, I'd say, between a 10 or 15-year-old property in Ho Chi Minh and one that was, built and brought to market maybe 2 years ago. So definitely, of course, yeah.
I mean, the thing about Ho Chi Minh is it's an incredibly dense city already, isn't it? With the
Well,
housing.
yeah, it's dense, but it's low rise. So and it sprawls. So it's a little bit misleading, I guess. It doesn't have the same sort of population densities that maybe Bangkok has, and certainly, uh, somewhere like Shanghai or any one of those, any one of the Chinese cities, right? Generally, they cram a lot of people into a fairly small footprint. So Ho Chi Minh still sprawls. I mean, the infrastructure here is going to be another constraint on growth. There is overspill now into neighboring provinces, Dong Nai and Bin Nhung. That's where manufacturing is migrating. But whether expat families want to follow because there's a lack of services in terms of schools, hospitals, all that sort of thing, then again, that's going to take time. But basically, if you're working in manufacturing in Bin Nhung and you've got family, they're living in D2, D7, D1, along with every other foreigner. And then, the assignee is doing the 2-hour commute one way to the site. So, I don't see that situation changing anytime soon either, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. For those of you who are in the webinar at the moment, we do have a Thailand and Vietnam poll on the left-hand, I see on the left-hand side of my screen, and we have got some general knowledge questions on here. There's 6 of them, and if you would like to give those a go, quick poll. They should be fairly simple to answer, and unfortunately, the hosts, me, and the panelists can't vote. And that's because we wouldn't want to make a mistake while we were trying to get to do the questions. So I'll leave it up there for about a minute, and we can also carry on chatting. So just having a look in the webinar chat, I'm not seeing that there's any other questions.
Could I ask a question of Debbie?
Yes, of course.
Debbie, is there such a thing as a hardship allowance anymore?
I think that it's not probably an allowance that is paid very significantly anymore.
Right.
No. The reality is that from a cost of living perspective and from, a reason to kind of reduce costs, specifically now that type of allowance is not so much payable anymore. Obviously, even things like COLA and other allowances have all been reviewed, policies have been reviewed.
Yeah.
And I think again, depending on the level of the individual, then this part of the world, you probably certainly won't see hardship allowances, definitely.
Yeah.
Not maybe
Okay.
not even for countries perhaps that you might have done in the past.
Yeah.
There's been development everywhere.
Yeah.
I've lived in places like Bangladesh and Pakistan, quite some time ago, which were very hard at the time. But, things have developed. And I don't think that that's an allowance that's paid in general anymore.
Yeah. Okay. Just showing my age, but it just popped into my head when I was looking at the sort of cost of living stuff. I remember when I was I lived in Kuala Lumpur from 1991 to 2006. In the 90s, KL was regarded as a hardship posting. I mean, it's just laughable, You can't get people to leave that place. They stayed
I
their whole
think
lives.
in my experience, it's very much around what is now available.
Mm.
When I lived in Bangladesh, as an example, going back a long time, there wasn't even international telephone lines and things
Yeah.
like that. Yet now
Yeah.
there is so much available. Thailand, Vietnam, we've seen, you can get virtually anything now. Yes,
Yeah.
it might be a little bit more expensive depending on what it is, but there's a lot more available now.
Mm.
And technology is very, very good everywhere. So there's not really anything that would
No,
perhaps
yeah. No
really link to
justification
what
anymore.
was a formal hardship.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Dermot. I would argue that technology in this part of the world is actually getting ahead of what's going on in the Western world. Recently, having been back in the UK and being used to 5G mobile network everywhere I go around in the Bangkok area or even outside of Bangkok, and then going back to the UK around London and traveling around, and you're struggling to even get a mobile phone connection. So it's almost tipped over the other way. So okay, so I don't think we've got any other questions, and I don't think we've had anybody answering the questions. But let's go through the questions anyway. So which country has the longest coastline, including the islands between Thailand and Vietnam? And the answer is Vietnam. Vietnam's coastline is 3,444 kilometers, which is approximately 200 kilometers longer than the Thailand coastline. Next question. Oh, where are my questions gone? Can I have my questions back, please? Oh, they've gone. All right, I'll read them out, see if anybody's paying attention. Second question was traveling by road, which is the shorter driving kilometers between Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, or between Chiang Mai in the far north of Thailand and Phuket, the island in the south? The shorter distance is Chiang Mai, Phuket, it's 1,530 kilometers, which is 100 kilometers shorter. Third question was, how many people live in Vietnam? Approximately 1.5 million, 53 million, or 98 million? Dermot, the answer to that one is
98.
and increasing by about 1% every year.
Yeah, they've got strong population growth.
Yes.
They've still got a very rural population. 60% of the people live in a non-urban environment. So they've got all of that to look forward to in terms of urbanization and demographic growth.
Yeah, look at what happened. I mean, Da Nang used to be like a sleepy little town 25 years ago, and now it's turning into a big city. Question 4: what kind of currency do they use in Vietnam? Baht, yuan, dong. Dermot?
I was going to crack a dong joke then, but yeah, I won't. There you go. There's the answer.
The Vietnamese dong. So when I going back to a little bit of history, when I arrived in Hanoi in 1996, there was 10,000 dong to the dollar. What is it at the moment?
Yeah, it's just under 25, 24 and a half. So yeah, there's been a little bit of flux in the currency. It's sort of depreciated earlier on in the year. It was over 25,000 to the dollar. Now it's sort of back down to 24,500. But still, yeah, relatively weak, certainly historically.
Changing almost at the same rate as the population, just in the wrong direction. Next question was, how do people typically greet each other in Thailand? Do they wave? Do they why? Do they do a handshake? Or do they do a fist bump? And the answer is that
they
why. In Thailand, people typically greet each other by performing a gesture called the Y. The Y involves placing their palms together in a prayer-like gesture and bowing slightly. This gesture is a sign of respect and is commonly used when greeting someone, saying thank you or apologizing, all of which I've had to use. It is an important part of Thai culture and is used to show politeness and humility. Last question, question 6. What is the population of Thailand approximately? Is it 17 million, 56 million, or 71 million? And the answer is 71 million. And there you are. So not only have you come to ATMA to learn about the mobility updates in Thailand and Vietnam, you've also got a little bit of general, the questions have been gone again, a bit of general knowledge as well. Okay, so I don't think there's any other questions. It just leaves me to say thank you to Debbie and to Dermot for your time in preparing for this update today, for the excellent information that you provided, and also to Renu, who's somewhere behind the screen, who helped us prepare for the meeting, and also to Steve, who was supporting us. Yes.
This is Steve. There is one more question. Came in from Calvin Chin.
Okay.
Question on Vietnam. What is a reasonable time before someone can expect to have visas ready to start work?
You mean a work permit?
Work permit.
Okay, yeah. Once the application has been submitted with all the necessary supporting documentation, then you'd expect to get the work permit issued within 4 to 6 weeks. But what's holding that up is that before you submit the application, and then you must post the job position online, you must get the foreign labor demand approval, and also what can slow down an application is that the assignee getting the necessary documentation to support the application can also be a time-consuming process because Vietnam insists on consular authenticating all the documents required themselves. So that is a stress point and will continue to be a stress point until hopefully they will sign up for the Hague Convention.
Yeah. We would generally say for anything up to 4 months, 5 months, because some of those legalizations take time, and so you need police clearances as well. So it's planning ahead. You need to think about it 6 months in advance at least to be able to meet an assignment start date.
All right, thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Dermot. Thanks for the question, Calvin. Are there any other questions, Steve, that I haven't seen that have popped up? Is there any other questions anybody else would like to ask?
No more questions on the side.
Thank you very much, Steve. Okay, so again, thank you to my two joint hosts today and to everyone that joined us. With that, I think it's time to say Sawadee Cup, Cup and Cup, and goodbye to everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.